In fact, first I thought that since I have to moderate the session, I should speak last so that there is no conflict of interest, but as has been directed, I will very briefly speak what I had planned to speak. The theme of this session is geopolitics and security of energy. It's a sub-theme of the overall theme of democracy and development. And on the issue of geopolitics, I'm sure other speakers, particularly Mr. Pasarthi, Mr. Mehra, will deal with the geopolitics aspect. Dr. Muzaffar Ahmad, I'm sure, will give an overview of the security of infrastructure, particularly with reference to natural disasters and other disasters. In this context, I would like to highlight some of the broader aspects of democracy and development in the context of the political economy or the political scenario. And this affects, though I will not directly deal with the political aspect, but some of the broader aspect I would like to address. But my focus will be to have a clear focus. It will be on disaster management, how to mainstream, not so much on disaster management, how to mainstream risk reduction measures so as to ensure the security of infrastructure. Because as all of us know, there have been major disasters in recent times, and many studies show that recent times there is increase not only in the frequency of disaster but also its intensity, as we have seen very recent experience of Uttarakhand. So an important question is, in spite of occurrence of so many disasters from time to time, and we have been advocating that there is a paradigm shift in disaster management. We have been saying since the 1990s, both nationally and internationally. But as we have seen, ironically, the same mistakes are committed again and again, whether it is Latur, whether it is the Gujarat earthquake, the tsunami of 2004, if we study in detail. And we know that managing disaster is not a very new thing. We have been talking about it when the United Nations declared 1990s as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. The Yokohama Strategy and Plan of Action of 1994, the Hyogo Framework, which is for the period 2005 to 15, all these have focused on moving away from a relief-centric or emergency management approach to mitigation and preparedness for ensuring security of infrastructure. But one thing I would like to point, and the other thing is that managing disaster is not a new activity. For decades and even for a century, we have been managing disasters such as drought, flood, cyclone, earthquake, and so on. In recent decades, we have been talking about new approach, and yet it is seen again and again that the lessons of disasters are not learned. I would like to put forward 4 hypotheses which unfortunately we have been finding that they come up again and again. First is the lessons of disasters do not automatically spread over geographical space and time. For example, when the Latur earthquake took place in 1993, everybody was taken by surprise. It was not known that that area could be vulnerable to earthquake. It was thought that it is not prone to earthquake. But a lot of good work were done. But those lessons didn't spread to Gujarat. When the Gujarat earthquake of 2001 took place, again we had to start from scratch. The Gujarat lessons possibly did not spread to Kashmir or the tsunami affected areas. The other hypothesis is that post-disaster recovery and reconstruction provide an opportunity, though we should not wait for a disaster to happen, but if it happens, whether we can convert the adversity into an opportunity. The third thing is risk reduction measures or initiatives have greater acceptability, speed and effectiveness during a post-disaster scenario. However, one cannot wait for a disaster to happen, and what is required is mainstreaming it into our development activities. Because in the earlier session also there was a lot of talk about the political interference and so many aspects, and this is bound to happen. And also, as I have been pointing out, that lessons of disaster do not necessarily spread over the geographical space, like I gave the example of Latur to Kashmir and so on. Similarly, it doesn't spread over time, because if it happens, for example, we have seen the experience of Gujarat, that there was an earthquake in 1956 in Anjar area. After that, some construction took place, and in the 2001 earthquake, those areas were not affected, but those lessons could spread subsequently after a few years. Similarly, we talk about the safe building construction, the building codes. We have been having building codes for 60s, 70s, but again, it is not enforced. In fact, there are certain studies and literature that an earthquake took place in 1931 in Quetta, now of course in Pakistan, and after that, the railways particularly started preparing the building codes. And many of the constructions which took place with the new design and building code, those could withstand the earthquake of 1935 in the same area. And after that, of course, a lot of efforts were made to have the building codes. But again, similar question arose when the Kashmir earthquake took place in 2005. So between 1935 and 2005, the lessons didn't spread over time, and it has not spread through the geographical space. So the main question is how to ensure that it is sustainable, will continue to derive the benefit from the lessons which we learned just after a disaster. So one thing which is being pointed out, that we have to mainstream disaster risk reduction measures. And mainstreaming means to integrate into the regular or predominant activity. Mainstream means the mainstream of a river. So how to mainstream disaster risk reduction in our development projects, in our development programs, and in our day-to-day activities. It is also necessary to understand the impact of policies and programs and projects on vulnerability. Many of the development projects can increase the vulnerability, and many of the development projects, which of course there are discussion about hydro, some of them may be wrong, but it is shown that many of the development projects, like construction projects, building construction particularly, urban construction, urban lack of planning, all those lead to more vulnerability and more intense disaster. Hence, we need to, the other aspect is there is a linkage between poverty and disaster vulnerability. In the sense, people who are poorer, more vulnerable. At the same time, vulnerability leads to higher level of poverty. So this we need to make risk reduction measures as an integral part of this development. And there are 5 steps for mainstreaming. It has been analyzed in the literature. I'll not go into this. For example, awareness raising, of course, is known, but enabling environment, we need a legal framework for disaster risk reduction measures. We have in place, after a very long time, the Disaster Management Act 2005. For the first time in the country, we have a Disaster Management Act. It has put in place certain measures, but again, how to enforce, how to implement. Recently, about a year ago, the Government of India, Union Home Ministry constituted a task force to examine the implementation issues of this. I had the privilege to chair the task force. A number of issues have come up that why our legal framework is not effective. And there is a linkage again between the legal framework and the institutional structure. For example, the Act envisages institutional structure from district level, like district disaster management authorities, state level, state SDMAs, and at the national level, NDMAs, how effectively they are functioning, what more can be done to provide them more effective mechanism. So all those issues have been highlighted. So in this context, some recent efforts, for example, the 10th five-year plan, after so many plans, for the first time, after almost half a century, devoted a chapter entirely to disaster management. This was the first five-year plan which focused on disaster management for the first time. After that, of course, the 11th plan, 12th plan have been operating. So the other thing I would like to show that some of the recent disasters like the Gujarat earthquake and others, they have taken some initiative after those to have a holistic reconstruction program which includes disaster risk reduction. But again, we find again and again that after that, like it is happening now after the Uttarakhand, lot of discussion, lot of talk about risk reduction, of security of the infrastructure. But again, after some time, we forget. So this is what we need to learn the lesson and to make it more sustainable. And the other thing which has been found that we have seen so many examples starting from Latur up to tsunami and the Kashmir earthquake, the outcomes are different. And again, there is the issue which comes of good governance. Wherever the governance is more effective, there we have better outcomes. So again, we need to ensure the important aspects of good governance in the context of disaster risk reduction, like appropriate institutional structure, a legal framework, participation of stakeholders, accountability, transparency and information, and so on. So the question which arises in this context is, can we prepare a roadmap for mainstreaming disaster risk reduction through development programs? How do we reorient our development program, the mechanism of project formulation, project implementation, and also project evaluation? And at the same time, how to make it more sustainable? And can we design an institutional structure for this? These are some of the important questions which arises in this context. And I would stop at this point of time because we have limited time. And I am sure that some of the issues could also be highlighted by our esteemed speakers.